publisher of 80 books. Thank you for coming today. We are all very happy and lucky to have the chance to meet you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm interested to hear your questions. Okay, let's go.
So I understand that you were a teacher as your first job. What did you teach?
I taught English and history to high school students, like you, for a very long time, for 25 years. I taught kids from a different range, kids that were slow, kids that loved reading, kids that thought history was boring, and kids that enjoyed it. And that's probably what started me off, because I found that a lot of the books at that time were set in England or America, but not much in Australia. And we were looking for books with an Australian setting.
Yep. And what sparked the idea to become an author?
A reader. Look, I don't know about the rest of you, but I still read an enormous amount. I started reading when I was 3. I still remember how thrilled I was when I found "the" in the local newspaper, and I could mark it. Reading was wonderful, always when I was a child. When things got nasty, because sometimes they do when you're a kid, I could hide in my books. I have to tell you that I'm old enough to not grow up with television. I think perhaps if I had grown up with television, I wouldn't have been reading as much over the years. So I read and I read and I read, and always at the back of my mind there was something else I wanted to do with my life. And when I had stopped teaching, I thought, well, what else am I going to do? And my friend said to me, "You've always wanted to write, off you go." Do you know what? You just don't sit down and write. It's a lot to learn about it. You know, you'd never sit down and do a magnificent painting straight off, would you? No, well, writing's much like that. There's a craft to it, an art to it. You have to learn all the secrets, and there are lots and lots of them, and you never stop learning. Let me give you an example. Can I just give you an example? Today I asked if something could be run off for me that I need to send to a publisher, because I need to go through it probably for the 12th time, even the 15th time, before I'm sure that it's perfect. And it still won't be probably quite good enough. It's really hard work. That told you far more than you wanted to know, didn't it? Who was going to be next?
Where do you write?
I have a special spot, 2 special spots, because I live in 2 places. I live in the city in a high-rise flat, and we've got a place in the country we've had for many, many years, and I have a spot in both places where I write. I'm set up, I'm very organised. I get up in the morning as if I was still going to school, have a shower, get dressed, have breakfast, and sit down and write. And I find that if I don't do it that way, I don't get things done. You know, this is how you do it. You've just got to sit there and write. Sit there and write. It's like practicing a piano. If you don't practice the piano, your fingers turn to spaghetti. Anybody here play a piano? Yeah? You know what I'm talking about. If you don't play all the time, the fingers don't work. Well, it's the same thing with the writing. No different.
And what do you do when you get writer's block?
Walk. Walk. Not as much as I used to, because I had an accident a few years ago and I've got a lame right leg. But I walk. I just turn off, walk outside. Oh, the other things I do are not so good. I go to the fridge and I find something to eat. Not so good. Or I go and do some cooking. Or I go and read a book. But mostly I find a writer's block does help if you just put it all away and just go off for a walk. And as soon as you go for a walk, you remember what comes to you, what you're trying to do. As soon as that happens. And it's really funny, because I came to Perth thinking I will leave my computers behind, and I'm thinking, where are my computers? I don't know what I should be doing. Silly, isn't it?
How do you keep yourself motivated to write so many books?
Oh, there's so many ideas out there. One of the good things that happened after I had my accident and got this silly crook leg was that I had to start catching a lot of public transport. Well, gosh, do you have material on public transport? Now, do you? Oh, good, somebody's nodding at me. It's absolutely wonderful. I mean, people behave. Sometimes people are really friendly and they talk to me because I'm not threatening. Little old lady, you know, you're not threatening. Which was harder when I was younger. Travellers love to talk to you because they're desperate to talk to anybody. If you're writing for kids, watching kids on trams and trains, you're invisible, completely invisible. Really, I mean, I'm serious. And watching how they behave tells you such a lot, such a lot. What was the question again? I'm terrible, aren't I?
It was, how do you keep yourself motivated?
Oh, how do I
Right,
keep
so
myself motivated? Oh, I don't know. I can't think of anything else I want to do, really. I mean, what am I going to do? Sit down, twiddle the thumbs, watch TV, just read? Boring. I like to be constructive. I don't know whether you would understand this, because you know about feminism, don't you? How women have to suddenly start being assertive and say we're as important as men. And well, I guess in a way I'm doing ageism, because I am old, and I believe that a lot of our old people get pushed aside. A lot of people who lose jobs in their middle age, I find it difficult to get jobs because they're considered too old. You've read about that, haven't you? You've seen it on TV. And let me tell you, when you get to my age, people really dismiss you. And people will come to me and say, oh, and how do you spend your time? In that sort of condescending voice, you know the kind of voice I'm talking about? And when I say I'm a writer, they blink, because they don't expect me to say it. They expect me to say, oh, well, I go to the doctors, and I go, you know, this is what's usually expected. And I do, because obviously the body gets a bit slow when you get older. But I really am fighting to say, hey, our old people are important, just like they are in China, just like they are in Japan. But Australia, you know, we're very concentrated on being young. If you think about it. Which is great, because you're the right age. But one day you'll be old and you'll know what I'm talking about. You might remember this.
Do you like to write the same genres that you like to read?
I don't know how to answer that. Look, I just read very widely. I'm interested in using science fiction because I think you can play with ideas. With science fiction, you can just take one idea, displace it from what the normal, and then see what happens with it. If you're writing historical fiction, you have to go back and research very carefully, but then you write about it as if it's the here and now. I worry a little bit about writing stuff that is happening now, because I think you can get it so wrong with clothes, music, technology, because by the time you get the book published, it's out of date. Because sometimes it can take 3, 4, 5 years. You know that book Cybertricks I showed you? I wrote that 15 years ago. It took me that much time to find somebody who was really interested, and then I had to bring it up to date, of course. But sometimes for writers, ideas, they kind of have to sort of sit in your brain before you actually go ahead and start working on them.
I know that you write in a lot of genres, but which is your favourite?
Whichever one I'm working on at the time. I'm sorry, that's a silly answer, isn't it? Yeah. Whichever one I'm working on at the time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are you planning any other books in the future?
Am I planning any? Oh, I sure am. I'm planning one that's set actually in a historical novel. I'm not actually planning it, it's sort of sifting in my mind. Set in Berlin in the 1920s. I've always been fascinated by Berlin, what they call the Weimar Republic. It was a great time with all sorts of wonderful things happening before, unfortunately, the Depression came and Hitler rose to power. You know your history? Yeah? Right. And I was planning to do a time warp. Now, do you know what a time warp novel is? It's when you get a contemporary kid who's suddenly magically transformed back to some other time. The very first novel I did under my name was called Mavis Road Medley, and I had contemporary kids, this was written in the early 90s, that went back to 1933 Melbourne. It was really just at the end of the Depression and things were pretty grim. And these kids are fairly spoiled, and I wanted to bring them back to show them what life was like for their grandparents, really. So, in a way, I'm doing that, only I'm going back to great-grandparents.
How long does it take to write a book?
Well, Cybertricks took me 15 years. Really, I mean, that's being stupid, isn't it? But I mean, I did the first draft. At the time, science fiction wasn't fashionable, so nobody was interested in it. So I put it aside and thought, okay, I'll get to it another time. So, look, you know what? I've got a book that's come out with Scholastics called My Holocaust Story, Hannah. And I was pushed to write that, and I wrote it and researched it in 3 months. It's probably the most difficult book I've ever written because of the topic, you know. So that one came out far too quickly, in my opinion. I would have liked to have had 6 months or a year to go over it and over it and over it. Sometimes, so there we are, you've got 15 years and 3 months. But one is commissioned. Do you know what that means? In other language, a publisher comes to you and they say, we'll give you some money. I told you we never earn enough. We'll give you some money if you write this book, but we want to have it very quickly because we want to take it into a conference in London, say. Can you do it? Of course you say yes. I say yes because I'm a bit silly and I like the challenge. But afterwards I'm cross with myself because I don't think it's long enough and I think I could have done it differently. So I think a book really has to take many, many drafts before you've got it right.
Where is your dream travel location?
I beg your pardon?
Where is your dream travel location?
At the moment it's Berlin. I want to get... Remember I was telling you about the story that I wanted to set in Berlin? I'll tell you how it came about. There's a street called the Gartenstrasse, okay? It's in Mitte, which used to be in East Berlin. Do you know anything about the history of Berlin? It was divided into two. One side was run by the communists, the other side was a democracy. And in the 60s, it had a big wall in between. And it was pretty awful for those who lived in East Germany because their lives were very, very restricted. At any rate, what happened was there was a wall between them so they couldn't go between them. And if they did try to go between them, they were shot. It was really very grim. What happened was the wall was brought down in the 60s and it became one. The same city became one. This was because after the... Oh, how do you explain this? This was because after the Germans lost the Second World War, Germany was divided up by the Russians, the Americans, and the English. It was divided up, okay? Because it was their way of sort of keeping the Germans down. So what happened was that there is a building in this street, hidden behind some other buildings that used to be a nightclub. And it was called the Hummingbird. And it was just a wreck, okay? It was just an old building that's a wreck. But it was found in 2011. It was so hidden that it had to be found, even though it was right in the middle of Berlin. And this company, this big-time company, decided they were going to rebuild the whole thing. And they are, that's what they're doing. They're rebuilding it and they're making it into an art gallery. And there's a penthouse on top, there's restaurants and ballrooms. It's going to be the most magnificent structure. Okay, so I thought, what a wonderful place for somebody who's just come in at present and standing there and pretty bored and should be home playing AFL and whatever they're doing, and to suddenly be whisked back into time about when it was the Hummingbird Theatre in the 1920s. Do you get my idea?
I've read that your parents migrated from Poland. Have you ever been there, or do you like to go back there?
But if I manage to get to Berlin, I might go to Poland too and have a look. I believe there's not much left of the places they came from, so I've kind of been putting it off. It's not as if I want to rush back and look back at the streets. You know, I lived in Perth many, many years ago, and over the last few days, I went to look at where I used to live. And it's now part of the University of West Australia, and the street is unrecognisable completely, absolutely and completely. So it's never quite... I mean, I knew it was going to be like that because I had looked it up, but it was still looking at it, I thought, there wasn't a trace, not a trace of where I had lived. We don't leave very many traces in the world. It's one of those things that is sad.
I have read that you are a compulsive knitter. What and why do you knit?
It's very meditative. Do you know what do you do meditation? Does anybody here, do they teach you meditation at school? When I used to teach year 12 and everybody was in a panic about passing their final exams, total and utter panic, I used to actually, in the middle of an English lesson, I'd say, okay, we're going to do meditation. And I found that it really did help kids because they were so stressed out of their mind.
I know you've written lots of books from many different genres, but what would probably be your favourite and what inspired you to write it?
It's a book that's not very well known. It was called Body and Soul, Lilbur's Romance. It was based on some relatives of my husband's, amongst them was a lady who had been born, what's the term? We don't use spastic anymore. She was disabled, okay? And back when she was young, and I'm really going back in time, the disabled were sort of put away. You know, we didn't like to look at them, we didn't like to know them. And this lady, although she could walk around, and she was very intelligent, was treated always like a child. She wasn't, you know, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that, they'd say to her, don't do that. And the story went that nothing ever happened to her. Okay, so there's nothing like a challenge like nothing ever happened to her, to a writer, is there? We're going to make something happen. So that was the story, and I set her in, I took her, not her actually, but I took the idea of somebody disabled living in 1938. What happened in 1938? Anything? What was going to happen?
World War II.
World War II.
That's right. And I set her in Melbourne when everybody was pretty pro-German and thought Hitler was doing a fine thing by setting up his railways and getting rid of those nasty Jews. So I put her into that, into a family that she knows that if something alters in that family, she will be sent to live in the Richmond House for the Disabled and retarded. That was the sort of threat that hung over these people. So she's one of my favourite characters because actually she's very naughty. It was fun writing about a character that is not a nice person. She manipulates life around her so that things suit her. Because of course, if you think about it, if you're severely disabled, you do, don't you? You don't want things to change. You don't want people who've been looking after you to go off and marry somebody else. It's young adult, by the way, very much young adult or even adult. So, in a way, it's my favourite book because she's kind of like my child, the book that's a bit disabled too because it never really took off. Because people said, but she's not nice. I said, yeah, that was the whole point. She's not nice. If you were that disabled and you're in that situation, you're not going to be nice. So it's called Little Bit's Romance or Little Bit's Romance. It can be picked up as a... Do any of you use e-books or read books on your iPhones? Okay, it can be picked up like that.
Thank you for going to Georgia.